Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of our ReSES ID seminar. Today, we will be discussing the relation between economics and democracy, together with Johanna Thoma and Ville-Pekka Sorsa. ReSES ID seminar aims at facilitating interdisciplinary dialogue on the potentials and limits of economics as a policy science. This seminar series is a part of our Argumenta project, rethinking the serviceability of economics to society. The project is funded by the Finnish Cultural Foundation. ReSES project is the public phase of our research project, Economics as Serviceable Social Knowledge, which is funded by the Academy of Finland. My name is Emrah Aydinonat. I'm a philosopher of economics working at TINT, Center of Philosophy of Social Science at the University of Helsinki, and I am the leader of this project. We are excited to have two excellent speakers with us today. Our first and main speaker is Johanna Thoma. She's a professor of ethics at the University of Beirut since 2023, and before that, she was an associate professor at the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Methods at LSE. Johanna's work has been widely published in prominent journals. She made contributions to decision theory, philosophy of economics, ethics, and philosophy of public policy. Our second speaker, the discussant, is Ville-Pekka Sorsa. He is the director of U-Health, Interdisciplinary Research for Health and Well-being. He's a research director at the Faculty of Social Sciences of Helsinki University. He leads the WellGo project, which develops sustainable solutions for ensuring welfare in future health crises. He currently studies the role of experts and ideas in various areas of policymaking. Before we start, I should note that we will be recording the seminar. However, we will not record the discussion part so that we have a more relaxed environment for dialogue. So thank you very much for joining us today. We hope that the talks from Johanna and Ville-Pekka will spark thought-provoking conversations during our general discussion. Johanna, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation and everyone for showing up today. I'm a philosopher talking about social science. So I'm especially excited that this is an interdisciplinary audience because I'd like to say something that's interesting and relevant for social scientists as well. So I hope it already is to some extent, or if it's not, to get your feedback of what would make it more relevant and interesting to social scientists. So the paper is called Economics, Policy and Democracy. And I'll start with a kind of background motivating question for this project, which is whether science, and I'll focus on economics in particular, provides policy guidance, can provide policy guidance without undermining some basic democratic values. And it would clearly be devastating if the answer to this question was no, because most people are both deeply committed to democracy, but also to the idea that science, and in particular social science and economics, should provide some useful policy guidance. But there have been some sort of classic potential obstacles to reconciling science and democracy, and there's a familiar technocratic challenge that I'll provide some more detail of later, where the idea is that at least some science is inevitably value-laden, and insofar as it seems problematic if it is unelected social scientists or economists who are making those value judgments. So that's a technocratic challenge I'll go into more detail on later. There's also a kind of standard response to this, which is that we should ensure in one way or another that the values that do inevitably enter such research have democratic legitimacy. And I'll talk about this in terms of the democratic alignment of the values in social science later. For instance, we could make sure that there's democratic legitimacy by asking for accountability mechanisms for expert advisors, by treating it as a norm that social scientists should be using values that are representative of those of the society in which they operate, or that there should indeed be some direct citizen participation in science, that we should be consulting people or be involved in deliberation with them when we make those value judgments that are inevitable in social science. My argument will be that these responses actually ignore one important aspect of the role of science in a democracy, and so fail to address a distinct democratic challenge for policy guiding social science and economics. And the core thesis will be as follows. So the concern of these previous responses, the value alignment responses that I just gave, is that the values that go into science and that then ultimately guide public policy should be democratically legitimated. Essentially, we're focused on the decision output. So the decision made by a policymaker is influenced by the science, and insofar as the decision should have democratic legitimacy, the science that guides it also should. But the outputs of science aren't just inputs into the decision-making of a public decision maker. They are also informing public deliberation and are potential resources for every participant in public discourse, so for citizens. And the responses that I just gave, the democratic alignment responses, don't really help with that role of science in a democracy, because there's a distinct worry. And the worry is one of epistemic inequality. So I'll argue that we should avoid creating significant epistemic inequalities between participants in democratic deliberation by distributing the epistemic goods that are created by science unequally. So we can think of science as producing these goods that everybody can use. These goods can be unequally distributed. And when they are, people seem to be unequally prepared to enter public deliberation. And I will argue that where there's significant value disagreement and greater value pluralism is feasible without undermining other important values, it's clearly desirable on democratic grounds, because value pluralism helps ensure greater equality, epistemic equality going into public deliberation. And this is where economics and economic indicators come in. I'll argue that value-laden economic indicators are an example where greater pluralism is at once especially desirable, especially important, and also often feasible. And I'll point at some examples of already good practice in the end. And the plan for the rest of the talk is I'll start with an extended motivating example to hopefully bring across the gist of the problem that I want to point out in this talk. And that's to do with inflation measurement and the cost of living crisis. And then I will present some uncontroversial ideas regarding economic indicators. Then I'll give some more detail on the technocratic challenge and the common responses to it that I already outlined just now. I'll then talk about the threat of epistemic inequality in some more detail, explain why value pluralism seems to be a good response to it, and give some examples where that show greater value pluralism at least to be feasible in some circumstances, and focus on economic indicators there. Okay, so I'll start with the example of inflation measurement and the cost of living crisis. This paper was written while I was still in the UK, and that country, like many others, was and is experiencing a cost of living crisis where the incomes of lots of households don't keep up with the rising costs of goods and services. And one thing that's really important in addressing this crisis is that public decision makers have good measurements of inflation that show both where inflation is at, where it's projected to go, and the potential impact of various policy options on where inflation is going to go. So we need a good measure of inflation in the UK. This is produced by the Office of National Statistics, and most countries have these statistical agencies producing such measurements. Now, what is the cost of living? Once we start thinking about this, it becomes apparent this is clearly a value-laden concept. So an inflation measurement intends to measure changes in the cost of living, changes in the cost of living or what we mean by that is it becomes, for instance, when inflation is positive, more expensive to stay at the same standard of living as one was beforehand. But what is the standard of living? This is clearly a value-laden concept. There are two ways of making it potentially more precise. For one, we could think of it, the standard of the relevant concept of the standard of life as what are the kinds of lifestyles people actually have, the kinds of services and goods people are actually consuming, or one could think of it as the kinds of basic goods that we think everybody should be entitled to. So both of those are ways of making the idea of a standard of life and the associated concept of cost of living more precise. Which one should we choose seems to be clearly a kind of question of value and to do with what should public policy be targeting when it attempts to address inflation? Is it about making sure people can afford the kinds of things they're already consuming, or is it about making sure people can meet a certain basic standard of life? So there's a value question there that needs to be settled when we measure inflation. Another one has to do with the aggregation of changes in the cost of living of different people, because either way of making the cost of living concept more precise will mean that the changes in the cost of living are actually different between different people. So some kind of aggregation has to be performed, and there are different ways of aggregating that potentially give more or less weight to different people. So in practice, statistical agencies that measure inflation have to make those value judgments about who counts how much, about what the relevant cost of living is. And in the UK, this is done by the ONS. In practice, what they do is they have a basket of 700 goods that are supposed to be a representative basket of goods and services consumed by the average consumer. And the way it's aggregated is different households are essentially given weight according to their share in overall expenditure. Now, in recent years, there's been a lot of criticism by anti-poverty campaigners of the central measure of inflation produced by the ONS, the CPI. And the complaint is that it doesn't capture well enough the extent of the cost of living crisis as experienced by the poorest households, both because the 700 goods in the basket don't include enough of the goods that the poorest households are actually consuming, and because the way in which the CPI aggregates gives disproportionate weight to richer households. So this was the criticism. And what I want to note, and what's important for the context of this paper, is there seem to be two levels to this controversy. One is about which values and priorities ultimately guide policy. So the CPI is a measurement that plays a really important role in policy making. So it informs the decision making by public policymakers. And if it doesn't adequately represent the interests of the poorest households, a consequence will be that the actual policy decisions won't give enough weight to the interests of the poorest households. So in that respect, this controversy is just a kind of indirect version of the first order political disagreement about what our policy priorities should be. But there's another level to this controversy, which is a complaint that in this case, not all participants in public discourse have the numbers they need to make their case. So the complaint is to some extent, look, we have to rely on just anecdotal evidence. We're all experiencing this pressure on our household budgets, but somehow the official statistics we see don't really represent that. So there's a complaint about not having the numbers and thus not having the tools to make your case in public deliberation. So that seems to be another level to this controversy. And that's the one that I'm interested in and that I think has to some extent been neglected in the debate on the reconciliation of democracy and science. Okay, now I want to step back and so I'll come back to this example later on in the talk. I want to step back and formulate some uncontroversial ideas about economic indicators such as inflation measures to build my argument on. One is the value-ladenness of economic indicators. So the claim is just that policy-relevant economic indicators are often value-laden, and particularly clear examples of this are measures of thick concepts, which are both descriptive and evaluative. And inflation, as I've just argued, is one such concept, or the cost of living. Other examples would be poverty, economic welfare, or happiness. And I'll look at the well-being literature in a bit as well. So I think this is fairly uncontroversial, and we've just seen an example. Secondly, a second uncontroversial idea is the fact of value disagreement, that people often disagree about the values captured by such economic indicators. So some of the relevant disagreements, I think, are of a more kind of philosophical kind. So when we talk about different concepts of the cost of living relying on different concepts of the standard of life, this is linked to debates on what is well-being. Should we just look at preference satisfaction, or is it to some extent an objective matter, what basic needs are when we talk about the standard of life? Clearly, there's disagreement about such philosophical questions, but perhaps more important and more relevant in practice are the kinds of value disagreements that stem from just conflicts of interests between different groups in society. And the inflation example we've just looked at seems to be an example here of one group just insisting, look, more weight should be given to the interests of poorest households, and others potentially arguing for more weight to be given to households like them. I want to count that as an instance of value disagreement because it's about how much relative weight different groups of people should get in public decision making. It's about the value judgments involved in aggregation. And I think if we include such cases, it's again very uncontroversial that there is such value disagreement. Thirdly, there's the idea of compounding disagreement over aggregate measures. So here the idea is that the more aggregate an economic indicator is, the more likely disagreement about the embedded values is. And here I have in mind two different kinds of aggregation, one to do with aggregating different kinds of effect, and the other one is to do with aggregating effects on different people. And the inflation measures, for instance, are aggregate in both respects because they both aggregate price increases of different kinds of goods, and they aggregate effects on many different people. And the idea of compounding disagreement is that once we go more aggregate, we have to make additional judgments about the relative importance of the things that we're aggregating. So we now have to judge, for instance, how important changes in the price of luxury goods are relative to changes in the price of goods for basic consumption, or about how much weight to give different people. A third uncontroversial idea I want to present is the desideratum of policy guidance, which is sort of deliberately vague because it's usually kept quite vague when you see people making this, claiming this explicitly, but it's extremely widespread. So I put it here as it's desirable for economics to give useful action guidance for public policy. There's some sort of weak ways of understanding this, where this is about that it's desirable that social science and economics produces results that are relevant for the pursuit of goals that a policymaker is legitimately pursuing. A really strong version of this would be that social science should produce all things considered measurements of of how well different policies serve society, and in that way would produce really direct policy guidance for policymakers. Basically, just tell them this is what serves society best. In this strong version, this is not uncontroversial, but I think in the weaker versions, it seems to be. And I think this distinction will be important for the following discussion as well. And then finally, there's the need for aggregation. So this is less a claim about social science, but more about policymaking. And it's just the idea that public decision-making ultimately requires aggregation, either explicitly or implicitly, because policymakers have to make a choice. They should ideally take into account everything that's relevant for making that choice. And so to some extent, you have to look at different kinds of reasons and come to a decision. And either you'll do that explicitly or implicitly. Now, suppose we take the final two of these very seriously and we adopt a very strict interpretation of this desideratum of policy guidance. That seems to be the motivation of a kind of project that has been recurring in the recent history of social science, and one that Anna Alexandrova has called the dream of a master number, where the idea is that, and often these were projects in economics can and should produce these master number indicators that should be the core concern for policymakers to pursue. And past projects that might be given that kind of interpretation would be gross domestic product as such a master number, the Human Development Index, to some extent in response to the limitations of GDP. And a recent project, and this is the context in which Alexandrova is writing here, is subjective well-being adjusted life years, or WELLBYs, produced by some, argued by some happiness economists to be an adequate master number, better than previous such projects, and actually advocated for by these economists to be adopted as the central metric for policymaking within government. And they've had some success in the UK, where WELLBYs now find mention in the Government Green Book, which is basically a manual for cost-benefit analysis for government departments. Now, what to some extent motivates these master number approaches is various kinds of pressures towards monism, by which I mean this focus on a single metric. One is that measurement is just costly, so it's neat if we can just focus on one kind of metric. Secondly, there's a political demand that policymakers like to have a kind of unambiguous scientific policy guidance, because they can then say we're sort of merely following the science, right? And thirdly, there's both a desire but also external incentives for impact among social scientists, including economists. The incentives differ a little bit between countries, but depending on what the policies on research funding are. But in many countries, there's this sort of very concrete incentive for demonstrating impact of your research, and sometimes like in very concrete terms, showing how a piece of your research has changed the course of public policy in a country. So there are these incentives for impact among social scientists. And then fourth, these single metrics have a way of becoming the focus of public attention, and then that again sets incentives for researchers to focus on those measurements that can gather public attention. So these approaches prioritize this fourth and fifth idea that policy guidance is important, and it's especially important to give this all things considered policy guidance. And given the need for aggregation, direct action guidance requires these metrics to be highly aggregate. But then going back to this third idea here, that just means we now have single, very aggregate measures, but there's likely to be significant value disagreement about the embedded values in those metrics. And this is kind of the underlying problem that democratic critiques of this sort of things focus on. And so there's a real threat of technocracy here, where usually what is meant is that contentious moral questions are settled by economists without or with insufficient democratic input. So that's the danger. There's a potential for the pathway to policy impact to just bypass the democratic process, where value judgments by economists just remain opaque and policymakers just follow the science. So I'm not saying that this is what always happens, but there's a threat of this happening. And this is bad on various views of the value of democracy. And the sort of basic underlying thought is that democracy requires power to be exercised by the people in some respect. And if this threat of technocracy materializes and the pathway to policy impact really just completely bypasses the democratic process, then power is in no sense exercised by the people. Depending on what your normative theory of democracy is, you'll flesh out in slightly different ways what's democratically problematic about this. Egalitarian views of the value of democracy are quite popular on that. On those kinds of theories, what's valuable about democracy is that it treats everybody as equals, either because everyone has an equal say in how public decisions are made, or because nobody stands in some relationship of domination over any other. So on those views, the problem is that a privileged group, namely economists, have disproportionate power here to make value judgments and impose them on everybody else. On a second view of the value of democracy, it's about enabling public justification of public decisions. And there are different ways of spelling out what public justification is, but at a minimum, it requires that that reasons are given and are publicly accessible for policy choice and subject to deliberation amongst equals. And again, this doesn't seem to be given when these value judgments are made in an opaque way that's not open to public deliberation by economists. Some see the value of democracy in instrumentalist terms, that it enables good decision-making because we're pooling essentially a larger number of sources of information when we're voting on something. And here the thought is, well, while scientists are experts on matters of their sort of technical expertise, they are not significantly more of an expert on the value questions than anybody else. So there could be benefits of pooling the opinions of everybody in society. And we don't get that reaping of instrumentalist benefits here. So there are different ways of spelling out what's potentially democratically problematic about this. It's the classic technocratic challenge. And this threat arises more generally where science is value-laden, but I think economic master number approaches are an especially stark case of this kind of threat. What's the remedy for it? Well, as already sort of hinted in the introduction, usually what's proposed is some kind of democratic alignment of the values that enter economic research. So, for instance, the construction of economic indicators such as inflation indicators. So a first response that we can classify as a kind of democratic alignment response is that there should be accountability mechanisms. So Heather Douglas has proposed this, for instance, that scientific experts advising policy should be accountable, and they should be accountable to two kinds of groups: to their home expert community for the accuracy of their claims and the proper deployment of value judgments, but to the citizenry for the value judgments embedded in their claims. And she proposes various ways in practice in which accountability could be achieved. For one, through the transparency and expert advisory reports, when we're talking about sort of formal expert advisory bodies such as the IPCC or SAGE, which was a scientific advisory committee during, which is the scientific advisory committee in the UK, and closeness of the relationship to democratically elected decision makers in more informal contexts, where the idea is, well, democratic decision makers, they are elected, there's accountability there, and as long as they pick scientific advisors who have values similar to their own, they are therefore indirectly accountable. Some worries about this. Well, one, can this be extended beyond the narrow context of expert policy advice? I mean, we've been talking about statistical agencies a little bit. That's already a slightly different context. Potentially we can apply similar ideas. But a lot of policy relevant social science just happens and at least originates in academic research, such as the well-being approach. And it's not clear how we can extend it to those kinds of contexts. And the other question is one of a lack of threat of recourse. So often when we talk about accountability, we don't only mean transparency and explaining our decisions. It's also about a threat of recourse if we make decisions that the people we're accountable to don't like. And it's not clear what that is when we're just talking about transparency and expert advisory reports. A second kind of approach says that the values that social scientists have entered their research should be representative of the values of the population at large. And the most famous example of this is probably Kitsch's idea of well-ordered science. He claims that values in science should be selected in accordance with the public good, by which he means the result of a hypothetical process of ideal democratic deliberation by citizens tutored by scientists. Some worries about, so this is a very specific proposal, Kitsch's proposal, but I think this idea that, well, you should just sort of take society's values rather than your own values pops up again and again in the values in science and values in economics literature. Again, there's some worries about this. How do you practically implement it? Also, given the hypothetical nature of deliberation on Kitsch's account, at least, so this is about what would the result of ideal deliberation be? That means that the proposal is actually insufficient on many accounts of the value of democracy, on both the egalitarian accounts and the public justification accounts. It's important that we're talking about actual deliberation and actual exercise of power between different groups, and the hypothetical nature here wouldn't be sufficient because there's no real input by citizens. And it also presumes that ideal deliberation leads to consensus, which is really not clear, especially when we talk about these very detailed questions of which precise aggregation procedure should you use in an inflation measurement. And a third approach, and this is sort of leading on from some of these worries, is the idea of citizen participation, or in the context of indicators, the idea of co-production, where we're directly involving citizens and in particular stakeholder representatives in the development of indicators. And so we're in a very direct way devolving value judgments to the public. This has been advocated for by Alexandrova and co-authors. One worry here is whether this is feasible for high-level aggregate indicators. So the cases in which this has been tried out has always been for a very small scale kind of contextual indicators. And it's not clear whether this really can be done for something like a national well-being indicator or an aggregate inflation measurement. But so I've hinted at some potential worries with each of these approaches, but I want to argue that whatever else their relative merits, all three kinds of proposals share a common problem. And that's that all of these proposals that we looked at view policy relevant science, and so far as it involves value judgments, as something that should be the output of a democratically legitimate process. And basically they're mirroring the way in which values for science should be selected, just on how in general decisions are made in a democratic context. So just like policy selection should be the output of a democratically legitimate process. So they're basically treating policy selection and values for policy relevant science selection as parallel kinds of problems. And often, and especially when we talk about the most aggregate indicators, as we've discussed previously, no consensus can realistically be found on the relevant values. And when we talk about the problem of policy selection, that's not a major obstacle. On any plausible theory of democracy, lack of consensus is not an obstacle to democratic legitimacy of the selection of specific public policies. So that it's a matter of debate how much consensus is needed for democracy to work. Potentially, we need consensus on some sort of basic matter, constitutional matters. But if we were to demand that for democracy to work, you have to find consensus on every question of value, it just wouldn't be realistic. So there must be ways of democratically, legitimately making decisions, even when there's value disagreement. But lack of consensus, I think, is problematic for the selections of values to be embedded in scientific research. So the sort of parallelism breaks down. Value selection for social science is not just like selecting public policies in a democratically legitimate way. Why is that? Well, first, I just want to remind you that earlier we said there are two levels to the controversy about inflation measurement. One, which is about basically disagreement about the values and priorities that should ultimately guide policy. But there's a second one, which was about whether everybody has access to the numbers they need to make their case and to properly participate in public deliberation. And democratically settling on some values and then basing your decision on that would be appropriate to answer the first question, but it doesn't really help with the second level of controversy, because whichever values and priorities we democratically settle on will be ones that are not shared by everybody. And they might still have a legitimate complaint once faced with a social science that only produces these democratically aligned measurements, that they now don't have the numbers to participate in public deliberation going forward. So the second controversy, the second complaint remains, even if we were to democratically, legitimately choose values to then put into our measurements. And essentially the problem is one of epistemic inequality. So as we've said, democratically chosen values and priorities will often be ones that don't reflect the values of a significant proportion of society. Now, if values and economics are aligned with those policy priorities, then that can create a problem of epistemic inequality, by which I mean that those who share the chosen values and priorities can use and trust the results of economics to a greater extent. They're better able to hold policymakers to account, and they're in a stronger position to make their case in public deliberation going forward. And so this is a problem of unequal distribution of epistemic goods that can impede democratic decision-making going forward. And I think that value-laden economic indicators are an example of a domain where this is likely to be a more serious threat. So I think there's some domains of values in science where the values are sort of insignificant enough or don't play as important a role to make this a significant issue of injustice. But I think value-laden economic indicators are an example where this can be a serious threat. And this is because they're value-laden to a greater extent than other social scientific research and other scientific research more generally. There's greater scope for value disagreement given their aggregate nature. And there are these practical pressures towards monism that I mentioned earlier. So the pluralism, I will argue, that is a remedy for this, doesn't arise as naturally, potentially. And the danger is that then significant parts of the population may be in a position where what they care about most is simply not measured. The responses to the technocratic challenge that we looked at don't seem to address this potential problem. So they do address the original technocratic challenge, and that now it's no longer the economists who are imposing their value judgments on everybody else. But as long as we settle on just one kind of set of policy priorities and settle value questions and just come up with one metric, even if it's democratically legitimated, this will create inequality because a lot of people won't share those chosen value judgments, even if it was democratic, they were democratically selected. Coming back to like what makes this bad on democratic grounds, again, significant epistemic inequality of this type is bad on various different views of the value of democracy. So we don't have to settle on one particular view. If we're following egalitarian approaches, epistemic inequality just is an inequality of power. We're better able to pursue our goals if we have more accurate and more value-apt knowledge about how to pursue our goals. Secondly, public justification is impeded because we can't demonstrate using those indicators to parts of the population how well their interests are being served, and they are less able to participate in the public deliberation that is also crucial on public justification accounts of democracy. And it also plausibly impedes the reaping of instrumental benefits from democracy, again, because some people are less able to participate in public deliberation than others. And the sort of general message from all of these accounts is that if public discourse is only fully accessible to those who share the, and let's grant, democratically chosen value presuppositions made in policy relevant economics, this represents a kind of epistemic tyranny of the majority, which is problematic on all prominent views of the value of democracy. So what would be the remedy for this potential problem of epistemic inequality? Well, I want to present first a kind of ideal of value pluralism. The ideal in the case is best illustrated in specific examples. When we apply it to value-laden economic indicators, it says that everybody has equal access to indicators that are adequate measures of what they care about, and we might want to set some bounds on this and enable them to make all things considered evaluations of policy options and outcomes. So we want there to be kind of equal access to the results of social science. And if value disagreement is pervasive, what this requires is the availability and public visibility of multiple metrics that embed different kinds of value judgments so that we can sort of cover all the potential value judgments that we find in the population. So this is an ideal of value pluralism. And it seems like, in theory, an attractive response to this problem of epistemic inequality. There are two core advantages. For one, as I've just said, there's greater epistemic equality going into public deliberation. So it addresses this distinct democratic challenge to policy relevant research that I've discussed. But at the same time, it still helps address the original technocratic challenge because, for one, there's greater accountability. When anyone makes an all things considered judgment about a policy, but in particular when policymakers make choices in the context of pluralism, there will be more transparency about the judgments and trade-offs made by policymakers because they now need to select among metrics, and we can hold them accountable for that choice of metrics. So we get greater accountability, and also less deference to economists regarding central value trade-offs, because the choice of metric in the end will still be up to the policy maker. So in a sense, science exits earlier than it does on the kind of master number approaches. So that's the ideal of value pluralism. Of course, now there's the question, how could this ideal be approximated in practice? Are there costs involved that in the end mean that we shouldn't pursue this ideal? I want to suggest that there are two kinds of approaches that aren't mutually exclusive, that can be combined, of potentially implementing greater value pluralism in the context of economic and other social scientific indicators. So I first want to give examples of these and then argue that, that they're both doing this more is both feasible, or at least sometimes feasible, and also in the context we're talking about desirable and can overcome the potential costs of pluralism. So one kind of approach is publicly accessible dashboards and of different indicators, and also tools that allow policymakers and the public at large to adjust the weightings of different components of aggregate indicators. So an example of the first, probably the most prominent example of a policy dashboard is the New Zealand Living Standards Framework dashboard, which is a kind of national well-being dashboard. The idea of dashboards in general is that they present various different dimensions of a concept we're interested in, living standards in this case, but don't aggregate into one aggregate indicator. So here's a sort of visual representation of the New Zealand framework, and there are different dimensions here: health, knowledge, and skills. And one can click on those, and then for most of those dimensions, you get various sub-indicators. Now, how does this implement value pluralism and greater epistemic equality? It's that this dashboard is equally usable by anyone whose values are adequately represented by at least some subset of these values. And we're not imposing a particular kind of weighting of these dimensions of well-being. So this is one kind of approach. The other approach I mentioned is customizability of aggregate indicators. And one example here that you can sort of play around with yourself when you go on the OECD Better Life Index website is the OECD Better Life Index. So again, there are, in this case, 11 different dimensions of quality of life. And you can use these sliders on the right to adjust the weightings of these different dimensions of quality of life. And it changes the rankings of the countries here in real time. So this is an adjustable kind of indicator. Again, how does this implement greater value pluralism? Well, it allows for different kinds of value inputs, different weightings to be given to different values. So it can be used by a greater spectrum of users with a greater spectrum of values. And then finally, just coming back to the original inflation example, there have actually been some improvements made recently at the ONS of how inflation is measured, and some are seem to be a direct response to the kind of criticism they've been under, and they implement both some element of customizability and also a greater variety of different kinds of indicators. Now, the ONS has actually always published numbers aside from the central headline CPI figure. To some extent, the bottleneck is more with the media not reporting on other kinds of measures and there being this focus on the CPI. But they've now made efforts of actually producing indicators that are really quite different from the original CPI, using, for one, baskets of goods that are much, much larger, because they're now making much more use of big data, using data they get directly from supermarket tills, for instance, or web scrape data. And that enables them to produce more different kinds of indicators, including both indicators that capture the spending choices of different types of households, both income groups, but also things like for pensioners who have distinct spending patterns and so on. And also a least cost indicator, which seems to be capturing something very close to what those campaigners wanted, namely the cost of the cheapest way of meeting one's basic needs. And the element of customization is that there's this tool on the ONS website where you can, using very much the original CBI methodology, but you can look at your individual household's inflation index. And that's very easy to use. So these seem to be at least some ways of allowing more value pluralism in the context of economic indicators. And I think they seem to be good examples. The implications for economics, I think, is that we should take the development of such value pluralist frameworks and the improvement of such value pluralist frameworks, insofar as there are deficiencies about them, to be a research priority. And also to resist the various monist pressures that I mentioned earlier and ensure greater diversity on a structural level. So that, the important, maybe one important thing to point out here is that value pluralism isn't something that can be achieved by any individual scientist. It has to be achieved by the scientific community as a whole. So the lessons are more of the structural kind to ensure greater diversity, and in a sense maybe are thus less restrictive on individual economists, because the original democratic alignment approaches would say, you individual economist have to take all your value judgments from society, whereas if we think that the paradigm should be a kind of value pluralist one, individual economists might be free to embed values that are their own in their own scientific research, because there might be a significant group in society that shares those value judgments. The important thing is just that the economic community as a whole presents a wide enough spectrum of different value perspectives in their research. I have a final slide with some potential caveats. Maybe I'll just briefly mention them, and then we can leave longer discussion of this to the Q&A session. So these are worries about value pluralism in science more generally. For one, there's a worry about greater complexity that comes with it. Secondly, this idea of potential exploitation of the leeway that pluralism gives you, or that gives to political and economic actors. The worry is that if you've got many different metrics that you can choose from, you might just pick whichever one serves your short-term goals the best, irrespective of whether it actually represents the values that are most relevant in this kind of case. Is sometimes called index rate shopping when it comes to inflation measurements. And a third worry, and I think this is probably the most important one, is that this might lead to even greater politicization of science. This idea of a partisan epistemology, that one part of society has their experts and another part of society has their experts, and they don't speak across the divide, and we've lost the objectivity of science, whatever that means. So there's this worry about politicization of science. But I think that in the case of value-laden economic indicators, at least, the initiatives towards pluralism that I reviewed keep these problems in check, and also the democratic advantages of pluralism are often large enough to make them worthwhile. Very briefly, as I think they seem to be these examples at least seem to be fairly user-friendly. I think the worry about exploitation is more about transparency and public scrutiny, the preferable solutions to this. And I think the worry about politicization can at least be addressed in this case, because these pluralist frameworks themselves seem to serve as common ground. So if we all accept the dashboard, we can all refer back to that. Or if we all at least accept the customizable indicator that can be common ground. So I think in this case, these worries can be answered, but this is not to say that value pluralism is always unproblematic. I actually think that probably the parts of science where it's safe to pursue greater value pluralism are probably quite tightly restricted, but I think economic indicators are a case where we should pursue greater value pluralism. And this is just a brief summary again. Concerns of previous responses to tensions between democracy and science have been that there should be a democratic alignment of the values that enter science. But I've argued that the outputs of economics also inform public deliberation, are potential resources for every participant in public discourse. And to serve that function, we want a degree of epistemic equality, of everybody to be served equally well by science, to receive the epistemic outputs of science equally well in a context of value disagreement. This must mean that there's some degree of value pluralism to ensure this epistemic equality. And I've argued that value-laden policy guiding economic indicators are an example where greater pluralism is especially desirable and also often feasible. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Johanna, for this great talk. Now we have Ville-Pekka Sorsa. He will kick off the discussion with his comments on Johanna's talk. The floor is yours, Ville-Pekka.
Great, thank you, Emrah, and thank you very much, Johanna. This was it's an excellent point, and I really think that epistemic inequality is a really important issue when it comes to economics, which is the focus of the ReSES project, because we all know, I mean, like the kind of a tendency of black boxing in this kind of highly technical disciplines such as economics, and I think like your argument is really good in that respect. Now I'm a social scientist who's commenting on philosophy, and I'm feeling perhaps even more excited about this opportunity to comment on your work. And I think I need to sort of visualize your arguments a bit to sort of illustrate my comment to your points. So if you allow, I'll just have a couple of kind of formulations on how I see the sort of key elements of your arguments. And now I sort of start with the dashboard things rather than end up as a sort of practical application. I think, like, for me as a political scientist, that makes more sense to start with it. So bear with me. So I think that key issues here are like expert citizens sort of participate in policy work, what I call policy work, in many ways. And we have this kind of different kinds of values, and we have different kinds of indicators that we use in policy. And we can see that, of course, like some indicators embed a great variety of values, whereas others don't. And what Johanna, I think, like I read a previous iteration of the paper, and I think that you make a very good case that aggregation is seen as a problem, and most sort of discussions and debates sort of start flowing from that. So from the problem of aggregation as such, in somehow, and all the responses that you are discussing how to tackle democratic deficiencies are somehow based on this phenomena of aggregation as such. But instead, you're making a kind of argument, this is my interpretation, it might be completely wrong, of course, but is that we actually have to look at the interactions, how this kind of indicator work actually influences our politics and policymaking processes. And what you suggested is that, there is a kind of it becomes problematic if this kind of indicator work sort of goes into the realm of citizens and politics, because then you get much more information on that already selected indicators and less about other possible indicators. So instead of looking at just aggregation, we have to look at the consequences of aggregation and consequences of this kind of value-laden indicator presentation in general. And this is just a visualization that I'm showing that how we might tackle this kind of epistemic inequalities would be that we as experts should provide this kind of dashboards that are very much available for policymakers and citizens and in our everyday life, and instead of just trying to push individual indicators to policy processes or just to provide information on individual indicators, it is important in society to offer this kind of dashboards that might help to tackle those inequalities. And I completely agree that this is an important thing, but I'm just and I would like to sort of ask you some questions. This might be really stupid questions because I'm not a philosopher, and so I might have missed some basic issues here. But I'm just using these visualizations to sort of frame those questions. So the first of would be like, I know that in your paper, and also you sort of touch it in your presentation, is that I think that these issues really depend also on how we understand democracy. And one thing that might be relevant here, and you discuss it in that paper where you say that, okay, you're talking about social sciences in general, and these kind of indicators and master numbers might be also produced in think tanks or within public administration. There is a lot of wide community of experts who are actually engaged in this kind of work. But if you look at theories, different types of theories of democracy, there might be actually quite important distinctions there. And let me visualize it. So if we take this kind of a very broad like view of democracy as something like that, take something like pluralist agonistic pluralism kind of move and Laclau style thing, where basically everywhere you can find some aspects of politics. And I think like in this kind of setting, like there is it is legitimate, and it is completely it is a good thing that we actually have dashboards that broaden different kinds of views on policies. But it becomes different if we take this kind of view that, okay, so the policy work is actually done by policymakers, and experts might be within administration as well. So we take something like France or even Finland, that very much like ministry-oriented country where ministries are key actors preparing policies and all that. So you might say that, I mean, this is an argument that could be made, but that I'm not making, but that it is completely fine that experts then participate in policy work, and they are very open to policy work, but actually offering these dashboards to citizens is not a priority, and doesn't necessarily revolve around politics in a sense that experts would play a kind of a significant role there as something else than just citizens among others, and so there is no like special epistemic authority in politics. So this kind of the relevant, it doesn't seem that relevant in that respect. Whereas if you take this kind of view that, okay, you have experts outside administration, then it would be, you could argue that, okay, so trying to offer these dashboards for administration it might be helpful, but still it's like your duties are going much more towards citizens and not so much towards the administration. So, I mean, I don't know if this visualization make any sense, but my first question would be, is like, how dependent is your argument on particular theories of democracy that one might subscribe to? And the second point, if you allow me to, is like thinking about your arguments. I think like this, of course, it is in philosophy, you might very often have like this kind of distinction between values and other things, and especially in context of politics. But for me, I mean, if I take this kind of evaluation studies perspective, or like French pragmatist political sociology approaches, we could argue that, well, you know, values and value, in this case, values and indicators, they're just two sides of the same coin here. I mean, like, we can't anyway evaluate anything with if we don't have values. But then again, we can't talk about values unless we provide some kind of valuations or value judgments, and those are actually embedded in indicators. And if we take a sort of a very mainstream approach from policy studies, and we, instead of indicators, we think about ideas, and we say that ideas as this kind of tools of thinking, as institutional frameworks, they co-articulate both values and indicators. They do the both things at the same time. And so we lose the distinction in empirical settings. And if we then look at ideas as objects of politics, we get to see a completely different picture. So if this would be the original picture where we make a distinction between values and indicators, what if we have like values and indicators within specific ideas where they might compete? And let's, for example, say that there are some kind of public sentiments, so that in a particular moments of time, you have like very strong subscription to different types of values, and you sort of agrees upon certain indicators, but not all indicators. Here, you might say that this might be the case, whereas experts might have more varied ideas of what is actually going around. So my point being just that, what if we sort of remove that distinction in empirical politics? That is not, of course, in philosophical terms, you might have this, but in empirical politics, I'm really sort of trying to think like, what would a dashboard mean here in this kind of contest, where you actually have a contest between ideas that embed, that involve different types of value judgments and indicators and all that are not separated, but it is just they where the contest is. So that would be my other question. So that how dependent is the arguments on the sort of understanding of indicators and value judgments of somehow very separate things? How do you see that? I also have some more detailed questions about economics and economists here, but I think they are more general. So I'll be very happy if you could sort of give some initial thoughts on these kind of questions.
Thanks, Ville-Pekka. Johanna, if you could respond. After that, we will move on to the general discussion, and we will stop the recording for that. So.
Okay, great. So, but the recording's still on now?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks so much. This was really helpful. So on your first question on theories of democracy, so I said that you know, what I want to say should follow on all major theories of democracy, and I went through some of the major ones. I probably should have caveated, and this is basically the literature I'm familiar with. These are like the prominent normative theories of democracy within analytical political philosophy. And I think one of the deficiencies of that literature is that it hasn't actually paid all that much attention, I think, to the distinction between what you call politics and administration, or insofar as yet discussions of them, often it's about treating it basically as a puzzle of how a kind of separate administration or bureaucracy can even be kind of reconciled with democracy, whether there isn't something sort of inherently undemocratic about the power that bureaucrats have. But there in general isn't, like, that distinction doesn't feature as much. And I think that's a problem. And I think I need to think a bit more about where to draw these lines. As you know, you had these different ways of carving up also where the experts fit in here. But I guess questions of the legitimization of value judgments do enter at all of these levels, and the kind of big political discussions that happen in public deliberation, but they also come up in the work of administrators. Like, you know, if someone in the Ministry of Health conducts a cost-benefit analysis of some health intervention, value judgments will be made, maybe in a more sort of tightly restricted kind of context than when an academic economist makes it. So I think the same kind of questions arise, but in a slightly different setting. And I think it would enrich the paper or follow-up research to pay more attention to that question. I hadn't explicitly sort of assumed an answer to this question, but I should probably pay more attention to it. On the second question, to do with how tightly linked values and indicators are, I think for everything I've said, that allows for them to be very, very tightly linked. And when it comes to measurements, say, of well-being, the value question of what well-being is really central to constructing any kind of indicator. I mean, philosophically, for various reasons, it's important to keep values and indicators apart. But I think potentially also politically, so, you know, that last point that I mentioned in terms of caveats to do with the politicization of science, if we acknowledge in an indicator something different from the value that sort of might be embedded in the indicator, or that the indicator is measuring, then we can agree, then even someone who doesn't think that that value is important can agree that this indicator is an adequate measure of that value. You can say, well, yes, I can see if I were to care about X, that indicator shows us that this policy actually serves that value. But as it happens, I don't agree with it. So you're not questioning the indicator, and you can sort of, everybody can acknowledge that this is a good indicator in the good case, even if they don't share the value judgment. So I think keeping the distinction might help, keeping that sort of common basis that helps ensure a sense of the objectivity of science, even if science takes these steps, or economics in this case takes a step towards some greater value pluralism. So I'm not sure if this has addressed all of your questions, but these are my first thoughts.
Oh, great, thank you. I mean, it certainly goes forward. I mean, like, of course, like if we think about different theories of democracy, you could also say that, like, those with epistemic authority don't necessarily play any special role at all. And I mean, like, you might say that, like, independent science is not a big thing at all. So it's like we're all the sort of determinants of our political order anyway. So as equals, and we don't have like special political authority in that respect. But I mean, others might be different, and they might suggest that we need some kind of special authority to sciences, and we need independent autonomous universities and all that. So it really depends on where you're looking at, what the question of or the issue of like scientific authority might be. But if you allow, I have one more slide, and the questions is like, what I'm thinking, and this might be more of a question to all of us here, would be that, does it really matter how this kind of epistemic authority is used when it comes to epistemic equality and inequality? So, for example, if you take, like, from political sciences, you take different theories of policy advice, you can very early on see that they provide different kinds of typologies and categorizations based on how this kind of policy advice is given. Are you a pure scientist, or are you a policy advocate, or are you an honest broker, or whatever? Like, for example, Pilke's framework is very kind of influential here. So, but one point that is important, I think, in that honest broker framework is that you can use this kind of epistemic authority to actually narrow down or open up the different kinds of policy options. And I think that in the case of the dashboard approach, that might also be true. I mean, like it's, even though you might provide different kinds of options, you might also construct the dashboard so that they provide you very kind of limited outcomes when you go and adjust all these kinds of things. And that brings me to a sort of question of how is economics special in our case, if we talk about all social sciences. So I could ask, like, are economists' dashboards somehow different from others' dashboards? Because, you know, we have like closed systems modeling, we have very strong and sort of assumptions of how things work, and it's very much based on this kind of system-based thoughts. Whereas if you look something like political history or something like, everything is open, everything is contingent and all that. So point being that our dashboards somehow different, even if we try to provide this kind of different indicators. And also I would ask like more like sociology of science question that I think like it is important for our project, is like, are economists more or less able to promote these kinds of dashboards? Because if you look at some influential economists talking about, it's like, yeah, well, we have this selection of models and we can sort of go in the world and show these different kinds of models. We need to be very sensitive about what models to promote, but still you have the idea that you have a sort of a certain menu of things that you can offer, whereas political scientists would not have a menu. They go, okay, so what do you want? What do you need? How could we do that? It's like, it starts from a democratic process and not from a menu of set options. This is of course very much a caricature, but I mean, like, you get the point. I mean, I guess that I mean, like, what kind of dashboards do we actually have? So that would be my questions, that I would be really happy to hear your answers and everyone else's as well, and to think about that. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks again. Johanna, would you like to respond briefly?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just a brief response. I mean, one thing to say about like dashboards in practice, for one, they aren't that widely used yet, and as I understand, in the New Zealand framework is also quite controversial what a success was. And my understanding is that they are also kind of interdisciplinary projects and not necessarily driven mainly by economists. I think, you know, economists on the more applied or policy side are definitely involved, but also other social scientists. Like the fact that statistical agencies giving a menu of different kinds of indicators, I mean, you can in a sense think of that as a dashboard, and those might be the more sort of strictly speaking economic ones when the ONS gives the dashboard. So in terms of what's actually happening and sort of comparing different disciplines' approaches to dashboards, I just don't think there's enough evidence yet to actually make a judgment what tend to be the differences. Part of your question, I guess, was the construction of the dashboard. You have to make a selection. It can't literally include all possible values one might have in relation to a particular policy choice. So you have to make a selection. Otherwise, the complexity problem would also loom large again. And then there's a question whether you have actually resolved the problem. If in the end, it's again, economists are making the choice, they might in the end actually narrow down policy options again in a kind of problematic way. And so I think to some extent, this is about supplementing the idea that dashboards are a good thing with also some norms of how they should be constructed. There's always a trade-off between greater pluralism and other things such as complexity, usability, and so on. By taking those trade-offs seriously, the goal should be to cover as wide a range of value perspectives within the society, rather than trying to steer policymakers in a direction that you happen to have. And I think in the case of economists in particular, what that means is overcoming an impulse, I think, to discipline policymakers. So often, I mean, I think there's a sort of very understandable idea that policymakers are either incompetent or sort of driven by short-term interests, and that they need to be disciplined by very action-guiding scientific results. But that in itself, of course, is a very technocratic impulse, because then you're sort of taking it upon yourself to make the value judgments. But unlike the bad politicians, you don't have a democratic mandate. So I think in part it will be kind of overcoming that impulse, which could, of course, also affect how dashboards are constructed. So the message is, I guess, is not just that we need dashboards, but we need ones that are well balanced with those other values of usability and complexity and so on, but also ones that try and achieve as much of a pluralism as is possible, while respecting those constraints of complexity and usability.
Thank you. Now it's time to move to the general discussion. Before that, for the record, I would like to thank both Johanna and Ville-Pekka for their great talks and for their contribution. And I would like to thank our audience for being here and also for contributing to the discussion in a moment. And I also want to thank to our team, particularly Anita and Jessica, for their help and work in making these seminars possible. So thanks everyone.